All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. Thank you for joining us this lovely sunny morning. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Hugh Kraft. Likely no one better to educate us on pandemics of the past and our pediatric history, as he would absolutely be viewed as one of the founders of pediatrics in the Roanoke Valley. Dr. Kraft is a graduate of UNC for his medical training. He also completed a master's in public health with a focus on maternal and child health at that time. He went on to Duke to complete a fellowship in perinatal medicine. Dr. Kraft first came to Roanoke in 1985 as a neonatologist at Carilion Roanoke Memorial Hospital and served as co-director of the neonatal department. He went on to serve as a pediatric section chief. He's worked as a pediatric intensivist, hospitalist, and the medical director of the Peds ICU. He became a founding partner of Carilion Pediatric Associates and the section chief of community pediatrics. He's regularly voted as one of the top docs in Roanoke and the best bedside manner. He continues to lend his time as a much in-demand outpatient pediatrician, preceptor, and teacher to numerous residents and students. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hugh Kraft.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I was, and that was a nice introduction. And I did not help found Pediatric Associates. They were kind enough to take me in, though. I was working on a different topic for Grand Rounds a few months ago, and I kept working, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And the pandemic was raging, and I said, I need to do something that's got a little more context to current times, because we are living through extraordinary and historical times. So we're going to take a step back into the past and look at some pandemics of the past and how they affected society, and maybe draw some parallels to how things are now. So I'm going to talk about three major pandemics of the past, talk about what factors contributed to the spread of these diseases, outline how the diseases impacted people in society, and discuss how medical knowledge and thinking at the time considered each of these. And this couple of images here. The image on the left is a physician at the time in full PPE of the time. A lot of questions about the beak. The beak had herbs and sweet-smelling flowers, because good smells were thought to keep germs or whatever they thought was spreading disease away. And then the image on the right top is a 14th century image of coffins being carried in large numbers and interred into the ground. And the quote is from a writer in the 14th century about what had descended upon them. It came like a mist from the east and spread the pall of death across all of Europe. And this was known at the time as the sad pestilence. And this quote is from a chronicle by Giovanni Villani, who was a merchant in Florence in 1348. And chronicling was kind of like the blogging of its time. And his chronicle is a widely known and read one, and he was chronicling the arrival of the pestilence. But unfortunately, he died of the pestilence before he could finish his account. And what we're talking about now is the disease that's had many names before it has the name that we call it today, and that's the bubonic plague or the Black Death. And to go back and begin to understand this is a map of the trade routes from the Far East to Central Asia. And as you can see from the map, there wasn't one Silk Road. The Silk Road was a network of routes. And the one we're interested in is the route that takes the northmost pass over the Caspian Sea and ends at Tanis, which is on the Black Sea. And that's where our story is going to pick up. And it's across the Sea of Azov from Tanis, that the city of Kaffa, which is modern-day Theodosia, the Genoese had a large trading colony and port there, and that's where all the goods that were traveling over the Silk Road would be taken up and put on boats to head to Italy. And that had been a long-standing trading colony that they had. The Silk Road in that area of Central Asia was controlled by the Khan rulers of the steppes, the Mongols. And they had some kind of a mutually beneficial relationship, because the Mongols controlled this area, but they allowed the Genoese to maintain their trading port and their fort for a number of years. But at some point, there was a disagreement of some kind, and the Khan leader of the time, Khan Janabeg, laid siege to Kaffa in 1344. And it was a prolonged siege to attempt to drive the Genoese out. As the siege continued, his army fell victim to plague. And the last thing he did before withdrawing was, this is the kind of legendary episode where the siegers catapulted corpses of dead soldiers into the city in an attempt to spread the plague before abandoning the siege in 1347. And there's good historical documentation that in fact did take place at this particular time. And what the Genoese did is they began to get sick also, and they packed up and headed west. So this is a woodcut image of the Genoese abandoning Kaffa and starting to head west across the Black Sea. And this map shows that as the Genoese left, they stopped at certain places along the way, and the colors of the map, the key is on the left-hand side, and it shows how plague advanced, and you can see that it was widespread in the area to the east of Kaffa in 1346, and as the Genoese trekked back across the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and back towards Genoa, the plague came with them, and it continues to show how the plague basically followed a clockwise rotation around Europe via ports and overland routes, and eventually ended up almost back where it had started a few years before. And here are our host, and here's our vector. And this is the black rat, whose reputation has never recovered from its close association with the plague. And the rat flea is the vector that transmits the organism from the rat and other hosts to humans. And this is a stain of the organism, and I'm going to come back and talk about the organism a little bit later. In this slide, a little bit of it got cut off, but the message here is that the organism that causes the Black Death, the plague, it's hosted in a number of small furry creatures, maybe even large furry creatures. And that's how it was thought to have been brought across the steppes in Asia. And the rat flea feeds on rats and other small mammals, and then can transmit the organism of the plague to humans. And I'll come back and talk about this also. At the time of the plague, it really seems clear from accounts that there was human-to-human transmission as well. But there was a lot of argument among historians and even scientists and microbiologists. Was Yersinia pestis actually the cause of the plague? Because the plague, Yersinia as we understand it now, is not quite the same entity as it was at the time of the Black Death. And this woodcut shows bodies being hauled to a churchyard, buried in great numbers. And if you read accounts from this time, the areas around the churches would rise 3 or 4 or 5 feet in height because there were so many bodies that were having to be buried in the churchyard. And the image below is one of these plague pits that have been uncovered over the years throughout Europe. Road construction, urban renewal, et cetera, and these were presumed to be the pits where people were buried who had died of the plague. And so there was a lot of argument and not clear-cut evidence that Yersinia pestis was in fact the cause of the Black Death. But this was settled in the late 1990s, thanks to modern technology. Teeth are a great source of DNA from ancient bodies. And the image on the left is the jaw bone from a victim from a plague pit, and the image on the right is an immunofluorescent stain for Yersinia pestis DNA from one of these teeth. And so this was really the concluding documentation that, yes, the plague, the Black Death as we call it, was in fact caused by Yersinia pestis. What was it that caused the plague to spread like it did? Well, there are a lot of ecological changes that have been invoked. And one of the references I'll note when I get to the end has a really nice discussion of that, which is worth getting into if you have more interest in that. Changes in how humans live closer together, crowding, more traveling, larger cities and towns. As that happened, sanitation deteriorated, and there may have been changes in diet that also contributed. Overland and sea trading expanded significantly, and as this did, the potential for organisms to be spread increased, and we're seeing the modern result of that today with the coronavirus pandemic. And then there's always been the question of did the organism change? Did it become more pathogenic? Did it become more communicable? And there's actually been some DNA analysis of the DNA from organisms from ancient plagues compared to the DNA of the modern Yersinia pestis, and they're not quite the same. So it's felt that potentially the organism was somewhat different at the time of these ancient epidemics. The clinical presentation of the plague, there are 3 basic presentations. The one we have heard about the most historically have been the buboes, the bubonic form, the large lymph nodes that are infected with plague. There's also pulmonary infection that can be caused by inhaled organisms or bloodstream spread, and then a septicemic form, which can likely complicate the bubonic form or the pneumonic form. And in ancient times, it seems like many cases began with local infection and then led to spread and death by septicemia. And this is an image. The bottom image is what a bubo, several buboes look like in an actual patient. And the top image is a piece of art depicting several plague patients at the time of the plague. So that's just kind of lymphadenitis we see in the bottom image. Now let's go on now and talk to what did people think caused the plague? Because the thinking about illness and spread, all that was completely different 600 years ago. And there were all sorts of possible causes thrown around. God punishing humans for sinfulness, the coming of the apocalypse, miasma, bad air. We'll come back to miasma a little bit later. It was thought that water could be poisonous, rotting vegetation could give off things that contaminated the air and cause disease. Earthquakes could release poison gases from the interior of the earth. planetary conjunctions. The influence of the heavens was felt to be very important, and all sorts of influences related to humans at that time. But a German physician practicing in the early 15th century said it is better to say the epidemic comes from God than to repeat all the opinions that one hears. And I think that kind of summed up the totality of how people viewed the causes of the plague. And I added this in just a couple of days ago because this is a conjunction of the moon, Mars, Venus, and Saturn. And this occurred at the time of the plague in the 14th century. And I put it in here because it also occurred in late March, early April of 2020. Coincidence? Maybe we'll never know. The plague, in many ways, it was just incomprehensible for the people living through it. It struck all ages. It struck people of all means and wealth. Clergy died. Prisoners died. It seemed to have no predilection for anyone, and there really was no clear cause. It struck with such rapidity and severity that it literally stunned middle-aged society. It was kind of like an animal that had been stunned and was stumbling about. They just really didn't know how to react to it. And this was because symptoms were rapid in onset, and often entire families would die within a day or two. Ships would come into harbors. Word would be sent out that there was plague on the ships. The ships wouldn't be allowed to dock. They stay anchored in the harbors for months. All the crewmen on board would perish from the plague, and there just seemed to be no escape from it. There was the beginnings a little bit more, not of the modern concept of contagion, but it seemed that plague spread when you got close to other people. The rat flea thing, that was centuries down the road. But there are all sorts of quotes like this when you read plague chronicles and tracts from this time. This epidemic, according to some people, has the power to kill large numbers of people by air alone, simply the breath or the conversation of the sick. They say the air breathed out of the sick and inhaled by healthy people round about wounds kills them. So, you have the sense from this that people felt like there was something that they were breathing in that was coming from people who had been afflicted by the plague that somehow made them sick also. How did people respond to the plague? Any number of ways. People fled. And there was the old saying about flee first, flee fast, flee far. Usual activities of day-to-day life ceased. Mass hysteria, other people just became resigned and despondent. There were religious revivals, and there was the other extreme where people just gave up any hope in the belief of a higher power. There were tremendous examples of scapegoating and persecutions, large Jewish persecutions at the time of the plague in Europe. And there was the beginnings of the concept of isolation and quarantine. That if you stayed to yourself, if you went away, you could somehow avoid it. And the imagery. This is an image from the plague outbreak in London. Family members abandoned each other, for this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. What were the effects of the plague on middle-aged society? Well, estimates are not exactly precise, but if you read a number of different sources, there weren't vital records at this time. Somewhere in the range of 50% of the European population died. It took 200 years for the population of Europe to return to pre-plague levels. There was tremendous social disruption. And interestingly, it's thought the plague may have hastened the demise of the feudal system. And the reason for that is that so many people died that there weren't enough people to work the lands, and so the lords had to start paying the people who worked their lands more to work the lands, and that may have been an important factor in the eventual bringing down of the feudal system in Europe. Religious faith increased in some, it was lost by others. A tremendous influence of plague on art, literature, and it's the most written about disease. Nothing else even comes close. It really tested the fundamental orthodoxy of humoral medicine, of the ancient approach to medicine, that body humors were what got out of balance, and it tested the physician's ability to treat. It's fair to say, for some time after the plague, faith in a doctor's ability to treat much of anything was severely diminished. And plague became endemic in middle-aged society. It didn't just strike once and go away, and there were recurrent outbreaks until the 18th century. And the legacy of the plague is it ushered in the Renaissance. It became the pandemic against which all other pandemics were compared. Plague became the generic description for all future epidemics and pandemics. And it inspired just this vast, tremendous catalog of literature, art, and architecture. If you have a chance to read more about the effects in ancient times, it's really just fascinating to see how disruptive and what a cataclysmic event this was. Now, I want to go forward a few hundred years to Hong Kong, 1894, because plague had struck the city of Hong Kong around this time, and three colonial powers, Japan and France and England, were vying for influence there. And the thousands of residents who could flee did. So people still recognize at this time that the best thing to do, if you could do it quickly, was to flee. And so many people fled plague, but a couple of teams of scientists were sent there. And this is Shibasaburo Kitasato and Alexander Yersin. Kitasato was a protege of Robert Koch, and Yersin was a protege of Louis Pasteur. And they went to set up separate labs to try and identify the plague organism, and both succeeded within a few days of each other in June of 1894. And so the plague was transformed from this disease based on just symptoms to a disease that was based on identifying the causative organism. Kitasato had the benefit of a nice lab in the hospital, and Yersin was relegated to a thatched hut on the hospital grounds. But that's also a fascinating story. That reference is fairly old, but that's a classic reference on the influence of the laboratory and how it revolutionized our approach to medicine. And plague finally remains endemic in some areas of the world. It doesn't seem to be like the same plague as the plague that I've just covered. There have been a few cases in the American Southwest, but it's really not a significant issue in our country, but is endemic in areas really spread throughout the globe. All right, moving on from the Black Death. This next organism played a major role in the European conquest of the Americas. And that is a virus particle that we see in the image. And this is variola major, also known as smallpox. And it's known as smallpox because there was, preceding its naming, there was an illness in Europe called the Great Pox. And the Great Pox is thought to have been syphilis. Smallpox is an ancient disease. This is Ramses V mummy from 3000 BC, and he has clear evidence of having likely died from smallpox. So it's an ancient disease, and it's it's been reported all over the world, and even ended up in Australia when it was taken to Australia by people who were who went there from England. Clinical smallpox, it's a disseminated disease. Some symptoms that are very similar to influenza or coronavirus, rash and oral lesions, ocular lesions. You can develop secondary sepsis as a result of it. The lesions typically become very pustular. They crust over. The mortality rate during times of epidemics, pandemics of the past, 20 to 50%. So it could be a very lethal illness. And it had a high incidence of significant scarring and blindness. The other thing to note about smallpox is the scabs from smallpox were contagious. The virus can be carried and remain contagious in the scabs for weeks after they're shed. In the epidemic of smallpox in the pre-vaccine era, it like all of these infections is spread by close contact. It's enhanced by the usual things that enhance spread of infection. It's spread by things where people are moving in large numbers, military campaigns, crusades, wars, and trade. As I noted, it can remain contagious for a considerable period of time. And it majorly impacted children. About 30% of childhood deaths in Europe during the 17th century were from smallpox. And as plague waned and became endemic and sporadic, smallpox replaced the plague as the most feared illness of the 17th and 18th century. And this quote, I think, kind of sums up how smallpox appeared to the people who lived through it. The havoc of the plague has been more rapid, but the plague has visited our shores only once or twice in living memory. Smallpox was always present in the churchyard, filling the churchyard with corpses, tormenting with constant fear all who had it not yet stricken, leaving those whose lives it spared with the hideous traces of its power. Now, I want to jump from Europe to the New World. And this may be a term some of you are familiar with, but if you haven't, it's something to become familiar with. After Columbus discovered the New World, there began to be this back and forth flow of all sorts of things across the Atlantic. And these are called the Columbian exchanges. And the next slide shows that there were what flowed from the New World to Europe and what flowed from the Old World to the New World. And if you note Old World to New World, the bottom highlight diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. That's just to list a few. This slide doesn't list syphilis on the left, but it belongs over there. It's thought that syphilis was taken from the New World to the Old World. But I want to talk for just a minute about the impact of the Columbian exchange of diseases across the Atlantic. And these are so-called virgin soil epidemics, European diseases that absolutely devastated Native American populations. And these were populations they had immune systems that were immunologically naive to all of these diseases, much like the world population is immunologically naive to the coronavirus now. And the impact of the virgin soil epidemics, it was just catastrophic. It's thought that in some areas of the Americas, 90+% of the Native American population died from the diseases that were brought by Europeans. And as this happened, the Europeans, in attempt to sustain their trading colonies, had to look elsewhere for labor. And they knew that people of African origin, they had some common immunities with Europeans. A lot of these diseases, like the plague and smallpox and others, where they were endemic in Africa, so there was immunity in some of the populations there, and this is what led to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. It's the Europeans' desire to have human capital to support their colonial empires in the Americas. The virgin soil epidemic subsequently impacted all the tribes and peoples all throughout North America, South America, Central America. It's an area really worth spending some time reading about. A very, very similar analogy to what we're experiencing now, except these diseases are much deadlier. And it can probably be said that the two most important weapons that led to European conquest of the Americas were guns and diseases. The origin of smallpox inoculation had been observed for centuries that people who developed smallpox and recovered, they never got sick with it again. And contrary to longstanding medical orthodoxy, smallpox clearly appeared contagious. It's just the understanding of what was the cause of the contagion was not known. And the practice of what's called variolation, inducing localized smallpox using drainage or crust from a smallpox patient, that had been developed and widely practiced in Asia and the Middle East by the 18th century. And it probably had originated and been done much earlier in areas of Africa and the Far East. But inoculation would eventually come to Europe. And this is an image of Lady Montagu and her son, and she was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey, and she had survived smallpox, but suffered severe scarring as a result of this. But she had observed the success of inoculation in the Turkish court, and in 1718, she had 2 of her children inoculated without complication. And then based on this and some other successful trials in England, the Prince of Wales, the future George II, King of England, had 2 of his daughters successfully inoculated in 1722. It's important to note that the 2-3% of people who were inoculated ended up dying of smallpox. So it was not a totally safe practice. And then smallpox inoculation came to the United States after it became available in Europe. And this graph, it's kind of a compilation. The years are a little bit fuzzy on the bottom, but the tallest one is 1721 when Cotton Mather and Dr. Bolston in Boston started immunizing or inoculating children with and adults with smallpox in an attempt to bring down the epidemic they were experiencing. And this practice continued, and we see that smallpox, the occurrence of smallpox, gradually diminished during the next roughly 80 years, and then in 1800. The smallpox vaccine became available in Boston. You can see smallpox was essentially eradicated after that. Smallpox played a role in the American Revolution. George Washington was leading an attempt to take Quebec in 1766. Smallpox broke out among his troops, and the attempt to take Quebec failed. Remembering this, he had his own Continental troops inoculated in 1777 to protect them. Now let's talk about vaccination and an English country doctor. This is an image of Edward Jenner, born in 1749. He was inoculated with smallpox in 1757. Fortunately, he didn't die. He was apprenticed to a surgeon in 1764. That was at age 15, but that was a common practice at the time. If you apprenticed to someone, but you wanted to get your MD, you then had to go study at university. So he went to London after finishing his apprenticeship and studied with John Hunter, a famous physician and anatomist in London in the 18th century, but then returned home to practice in 1773. And it was during his time as an apprentice that he was a keen observer. He noted that milkmaids who spent a lot of time in the barn never seemed to get smallpox. They did get, however, what was called cowpox. And this is the hand of a person with cowpox bumps on the hand. And Jenner took the leap of, well, maybe cowpox infection can somehow protect you against smallpox. So he took some drainage from a milkmaid's hand from a bump, and in May 1796, inoculated his gardener's 8-year-old son. The son experienced typical cowpox, rash, a little bit of fever, got well, and then several months later, Jenner inoculated the boy again with smallpox. That's a pretty strong faith in the doctor, and the faith in the doctor on the part of the boy's parents, and the boy remained well. So this was the first example of vaccination for smallpox. We've been talking about inoculation. Jenner wrote a paper describing this that was immediately rejected by the Royal Society. How many times have we seen that before in past examples? So he published his own little book, and that book is still available in reprint, and it's a nice, thin little account of his experience with smallpox and smallpox vaccination, and it's really a fascinating read. And slowly, vaccination became accepted and widespread. But as we've seen in current time, it was not always without controversy. And there was all sorts of pushback by certain groups, and it was a great source of material for political cartoons. The one on the left is Jenner and other doctors vanquishing the anti-vaxxers. And on the right is Jenner administering smallpox vaccine, and we see people who've been vaccinated have developed various complications, such as cow heads growing out of various parts of their body. So this kind of the sentiment that we've experienced most recently with the measles vaccine, nothing new there. And this was Jenner's prophecy on the smallpox vaccination. It now becomes too manifest to admit of controversy that the annihilation of the smallpox must be the final result of this practice. Jenner wrote that in 1804. It took about 180 years for this to be realized. And I threw this image in. An admirer of Jenner built a little hut in Jenner's backyard. It was called the Temple of Vaccinia. And when Jenner retired, he would meet people out there, and on certain days, people would bring their children in, and Dr. Jenner would vaccinate them against smallpox in his backyard. Smallpox did become the first disease to be eliminated worldwide. And this is the slide from the WHO data that shows the beginning of worldwide eradication of smallpox in 1967, and then by 1980, smallpox was declared eliminated. So that's a tremendous public health story. And Jenner's prophecy did, in fact, come true. Just took some time to get there. So that is a quick run through smallpox. A lot more interesting things to that story. So if you have time, get into that a little bit more. All right, moving on to our final pandemic. Understanding how this disease spread sparked the rise of modern epidemiology. Here we have a cyclist relaxing in London, leaning up against a pump in a busy city square, and we'll come back to that pump a little bit later. What we're talking about now is cholera, and this is the cholera organism on the left. And the link between cholera and water is one of the kind of indelible connections that exists within infectious diseases, and we're going to explore that a little bit more detail now. Cholera is an ancient disease. Its ancestral region is the Ganges Delta region in India, and it's been endemic in India for centuries. This shows the known cholera pandemics, but there were likely many other ones, and these became a kind of a regular occurrence in the 19th century. And the reason for that is India was a British colonial part of the British colonial empire, and there was trade and people moving back and forth between Europe and India constantly over these years, and that was important in the spread of cholera. The signs and symptoms of cholera: significant abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, restless irritability, myalgias, profuse watery diarrhea. But the big issue with cholera is you can have profound water and electrolyte loss and rapid dehydration and death. And it's somewhat unique in the severity of the diarrhea and electrolyte loss among bacterial infections. Now, to touch now on what were municipal water supplies like during this time? Well, there were a variety of sources, but in cities of towns of any size, they were all contaminated. Market squares, stables, slaughterhouses, human waste was just dumped in the street. Animal waste was everywhere. Cemeteries, bodies were being buried in churchyards and other places, and waste was just being dumped. There was not much. Cities outgrew the infrastructure, the ability of cities to kind of manage the refuse and things that were produced by large numbers of people living close together. So for most people, sources of clean water did not exist. And that was the case in York, England, where John Snow was born in 1813. He was the oldest of 9. His dad was just a laborer. He was apprenticed to a surgeon also at a young age. And in 1831, the first cholera epidemic in England began in Newcastle. So he observed cholera from a young age. In 1832, the local physicians in Newcastle founded a small medical school. And Snow was a student in the first class of 8 students. But after finishing this, he wanted to get his MD, so he walked 400 miles to London to enroll in a university program. And after he completed this, he eventually returned to practice. Snow was a very curious guy. He died at a relatively young age, but if he had lived to a ripe old age, I think the discoveries and contributions that he made would have been even greater than they were. But during his medical training, he discovered that inhalation of arsenic vapors cause illness, and he published his first paper when he was in medical school. He opened his practice for surgery and general practice in Soho, which was a London suburb, in 1844, and he also carried out lab investigations at his home office. And back then, the doctor's home was his office, and if you were a scientist, the doctor's home was his lab. Hospital labs, university labs didn't exist at this time. He had a very keen interest in respiratory physiology. And ether had been discovered around this time. Chloroform followed shortly thereafter, and he developed the first device for administering ether safely. And Snow is held in as high esteem by the anesthesiologists as he is by the epidemiologists. And over the next 12 years, he performed over 5,000 anesthetic procedures. Queen Victoria got word of this, and she had him give her anesthesia for the deliveries of her 8th and 9th children. And when this happened, the acceptance of anesthesia was explosive. But Snow didn't remain just an anesthesiologist. He was very interested in disease and illness. And in 1848, the second cholera epidemic struck England. And at that time, the prevailing theories were kind of like what I talked about with the plague: bad air, things on the ground, rotting trash, rotting vegetation. The concept of contagion, it just was still kind of ephemeral. It just wasn't well developed. Bacteria and viruses hadn't been discovered. But Snow observed that cholera seemed to be more prevalent in certain parts of London, and in particularly where in areas where the river was contaminated by runoff from the city. And he published a small paper about this, and the Lancet published an editorial that was critical of his study, kind of the similar case with our story about smallpox. Let me go back. I'm gotten a little bit ahead. Anyway, then the summer of 1854, cholera returned to London, and the Soho area where Snow practiced was particularly hard hit. And over 500 people died in August in just that one London suburb. But Snow noticed that the deaths seemed to cluster, and he had made this connection between water and disease, and he noticed that the cases clustered around the much frequented Broad Street pump. So he gathered data on location of deaths, number of cases from surrounding areas, establishments with their own water supplies. And there were two deaths that puzzled him, a woman and her niece who lived some distance from the pump. But being a good early epidemiologist, he interviewed the son of the woman, and he related that his mother had water from the Broad Street pump delivered to her home because she particularly liked the taste. And this is Snow's map from his publication, and I have another map with a little better detail, but the height of the bars correlate with numbers of deaths. And you can clearly see that the deaths do seem to cluster in this one central area of Soho. And this map has a couple of things noted, which I think provides a little more clarity. The pump is where the red star is. That's on the corner of Broad and Cambridge. And there were two places that had no cases. And that was a workhouse and a brewery. A workhouse is it's kind of like a place for white collar criminals to go and who aren't dangerous and can kind of work and get back into society. They had their own water supply, and thus they had no cases of cholera. When Snow presented his data to the local parish, and the parishes were the church parishes were who they were the governing bodies in these neighborhoods. They had the pump handle removed, the epidemic waned, and they eventually replaced the pump handle. But miasma theory, bad air, continued to prevail until well after Snow's death in 1858. But Robert Koch provided the final nail in the coffin of this with his discovery, first of tuberculosis and then of cholera in 1883. And then Snow's legacy, returning to the pump, we saw in the first slide, we see the John Snow pub in the background. And in England, if you miss out on knighthood, your consolation is having a pub named for you. And this is really ironic because in Snow's case, he was a lifelong teetotaler. But Snow's detailed studies of cholera are considered really the foundation of the modern science of epidemiology. And then cholera post-Snow, we have the discovery of bacteria, including the cholera bacteria. Robert Koch got the Nobel Prize for discovering tuberculosis. And there have been a number of safe and effective cholera vaccines that have been developed, including one that was just licensed by the FDA that you can receive if you're going to travel in an area where cholera is still endemic, which it still is in a number of areas of the world. So, just in summary, as the COVID epidemic reminds us, epidemics and pandemics have occurred during all of recorded history. The common denominators then are the same ones now: trade, travel, war, population density, people traveling and working together, amplify spread and misery, and that's exactly what we're seeing now. Took centuries for miasma theory to be disproven and contagion to be accepted. Old age beliefs have significant staying power. And, what are we thinking and doing now that future generations will shake their heads at? hopefully not too much. Just a historical footnote, the histories of the three pandemics I presented here, they have been simplified due to the necessities of time and space. The complete stories are a lot more rich and fascinating and include a lot of people I just didn't have time to include. But if you have time and want to explore one or more of these in more detail, there are a lot more interesting things to read about and learn about. These are some suggested readings just as a start. The top one is kind of a treatise on epidemics in society. The second one, that's McNeil's classic 1977 book on plagues and people, deals a lot with the ecological factors that were important. And then I mentioned Transforming Plague, Laboratory and Identity of Infectious Disease. That's an old text, but it's classic. Reading a little bit on additional on Jenner would be very interesting. The Ghost Map is a classic recounting of the cholera epidemic in London. And then the last one is a very recent publication, September, in Emerging Pandemic Disease, How We Got COVID-19, of which Anthony Fauci is one of the co-authors. And I highly recommend that if you want to kind of get up to speed on, how we ended up where we are now. And Janie said I had to put 3 questions in. So here are the questions. Which of the following statements about smallpox is not correct? Smallpox is an ancient disease. Inoculation against smallpox was brought to Europe from the Middle East. If you survived smallpox, there were no lasting effects. Smallpox was the first infectious disease to be eliminated worldwide. And I'll send the answers to Janie, and she'll send them out a little bit later. That's question 1. Question 2, what was John Snow's key observation related to the occurrence of cholera? Cholera always presented with fever. Water sources in a cholera outbreak were contaminated with bacteria. Cholera in England was rarely fatal. Cholera deaths clustered in certain areas of London. And finally, question 3, just to keep this a little bit lighthearted, because we're living through difficult times, which planet was not in the conjunction that occurred at the time of the plague in the 14th century and at the time of the coronavirus in 2020? Jupiter, Venus, Mars, or Saturn? So y'all can select your answers, and Janie will send out the correct ones. And that's all I have to present. If we have a tiny bit of time for questions, if there are any.
One question from Dr. Hughes was, what makes smallpox so lethal? Is it a secondary sepsis?
I think it's a good question. I think people died of smallpox because it could be an overwhelming infection like influenza, but I think secondary infection clearly played a role as well. I'm not sure which was predominant. I suspect just severe infection was predominant.
And then a question from Dr. Vaccaro. He said, Dr. Jenner retired and vaccinated people in his backyard hut. Was cowpox the agent, and how did he store it?
Cowpox was the agent, and that's why it went from inoculation to vaccination. Vacca, V-A-C-C, is Latin for cow. And I have not read how he stored it. I suspect he just had some scabs and cowpox material that he kept in his hut, but that's something to be worth reading a little more about and see if there's more information on it.
And we have a comment from Dr. Griffin. He says there's a great page on smallpox on the CDC website under for clinicians tabs, which shows different and more fatal subtypes of presentations, such as hemorrhagic subtype, which is more fatal.